How did 30 Sherman tanks, machines weighing over 30 tons each, cross a raging river in the middle of a battlefield, using nothing more than canvas? And why did the men who built these improvised rafts call them canvas coffins? It was the early hours of September 12, 1944, on the western edge of the Moselle River, just outside the shattered French village of Arneville. The U.S. 5th Infantry Division and the 735th Tank Battalion were staring at a problem that threatened to halt the entire advance toward Metz, one of the most heavily fortified German strongholds in all of Europe. The Moselle wasn't just a river, it was an obstacle designed by nature and made lethal by war. Its waters ran fast, swollen from recent rain. On the opposite bank, elements of the German 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division and remnants of the 3rd Panzergrenadier Regiment waited with machine guns, mortars and pre-sighted artillery ready to cut down anything that tried to cross. But the American infantry already had a tenuous bridgehead. What they didn't have were tanks. Without armor, the men on the far bank knew they wouldn't survive the next counterattack. So, on that cold, wet morning, engineers and tank crews prepared a desperate, almost unbelievable solution. One that defied logic, physics and in many ways fate. They would build makeshift flotation skirts of canvas and air, wrap them around Sherman tanks, and try to float them across a river under enemy fire. And for the crews inside those 30-ton steel beasts, it felt like climbing into their own graves. The canvas coffins were about to be tested, against a river, against the Germans and against Time Itzel. The story of the canvas coffins began long before the first tank rolled toward the Moselle. By September 1944, the U.S. Third Army, commanded by General George S. Patton, had surged across France with unprecedented speed. But now, standing between Patton's forces and Germany itself was the fortress city of Metz, a place the Germans had spent decades preparing for war. Metz wasn't simply defended. It was engineered to be impenetrable. Dozens of interlocking forts, hardened bunkers and reinforced artillery positions surrounded the approaches. To breach this shield, American units needed a secure crossing of the Moselle River, a natural moat the Germans were determined to defend at all costs. The 5th Infantry Division, under Major General Leroy Irwin, was tasked with establishing that foothold. On September 10th and 11th, infantrymen clawed their way across the Moselle near Arneville, using assault boats under a storm of German fire. They succeeded but barely. Their position on the far bank was exposed, fragile, and hanging by a thread. What they desperately needed was armor. They needed the M4 Sherman tanks of the 735th Tank Battalion, tanks that could repel counterattacks, provide direct fire support, and secure the bridgehead before German reserves could crush it. But the Moselle posed a brutal reality. No bridge. No ferries. No heavy pontoon system ready in time. The engineers of the 1103rd Engineer Combat Group faced a seemingly unsolvable dilemma. They had failed to anchor a treadway bridge across the swelling river the previous day. Every hour lost increased the odds that German forces would launch a devastating counterattack. Then came the idea, one that seemed insane yet was their only option. Engineer officers proposed to resurrect a concept first tested during amphibious training: canvas flotation screens. Large rubberized canvas skirts would be wrapped around each Sherman tank and inflated to provide buoyancy. In theory, the tank would float just enough to be pushed or ferried across the water. In theory. These flotation screens had never been used in combat. They had never been used on a fast-moving river. They had never been used under artillery fire. And they had certainly never been used on a 30-ton tank designed for land, not water. Tankers who heard the plan began calling the improvised rafts canvas coffins. The name spread quickly. Because if the seam failed, if the fabric tore, if the air escaped, or if the river current proved too strong, the tank and all 5 men inside would vanish beneath the surface in minutes. Still, there was no choice. Without tanks, the bridgehead would die. With tanks, they might hold. And so, on September 12th, as the rain eased and a cold mist rose from the Moselle, crews from the 735th Tank Battalion began preparing their machines for a mission that felt like suicide disguised as engineering. Little did they know, what happened next would become one of the most daring armored crossings of the entire European campaign. The morning of September 12, 1944 began with a low fog clinging to the river. It muffled sound, blurred shapes, and turned the Moselle into a gray, shifting void. For the tank crews of the 735th Tank Battalion, it was both a blessing and a curse, cover from German observers, yet a shroud that made every movement feel uncertain. On the western bank, engineers worked feverishly. Massive rubberized canvas skirts, each one more than 5 feet tall, were unrolled and spread out like strange, oversized life jackets. Crews moved around their Shermans with frantic precision, bolting the framing brackets to hull plates, sealing gaps with adhesive, and attaching air hoses to the portable compressors. The tanks looked grotesque, wrapped in sagging sheets of canvas that fluttered in the wind. A few young infantrymen watching from nearby muttered that the tanks resembled lifeboats on a sinking ship. By 0700 hours, the first set of flotation screens were nearly inflated. The canvas bulged and stiffened, turning each Sherman into a crude, awkward raft. Every engineer knew the margin for error was razor thin. A single tear could doom a 5-man crew. Tank Commander Staff Sergeant Walter Red Markham, a veteran of Normandy and the breakout at St. Lo, stepped back and surveyed his modified machine. The sight made his stomach churn. He muttered to his driver, Private First Class Don Keller, "Feels like we're being wrapped up for burial." Keller tried to grin but failed. He simply replied, "Long as we cross before that happens, Sarg." Across the river the Germans were not idle. Observers from the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division reported unusual activity along the western bank. The previous day's failed bridge attempt had put them on alert. While the fog limited visibility, the growing rumble of engines, even muffled beneath canvas, carried across the water. German artillery crews adjusted their sights. Mortars were readied. Machine gun nests reinforced their firing lanes. They knew the Americans would try again. What they didn't know, what they couldn't imagine, was the method. By 0930 hours the fog began to lift, revealing the Moselle's cold, churning surface. Engineers seized the moment. If the crossing was to happen, it had to happen now. The tanks were brought closer to the water's edge. This was the point where doubt crept in, the moment when theory met reality. Sherman No. 12 rolled forward first. It creaked under the weight of the inflated screen. The riverbank sloped downward sharply. Every man watching held his breath. The tank eased forward until its front edge met the water. It dipped, slowly, dangerously, then stabilized. The canvas skirt bulged, strained, and held. A collective exhale rippled across the shore. Sherman No. 12 floated. Not gracefully, not confidently, but it floated. Yet flotation was only the first challenge. The current ran at nearly 6 miles per hour, fast enough to spin the tank sideways and capsize it. To counter this, engineers had positioned assault boats with outboard motors to guide each tank like a tugboat guiding a barge. It was, as one observer later wrote, a ballet of steel, canvas, and desperation. By 1100 hours, the first 3 tanks were in position to begin the crossing. Infantry on the far bank radioed that German patrols were probing their lines, searching for weaknesses. The bridgehead was barely holding. Every minute counted. Sergeant Markham's tank, Sherman No. 17, waited in the second wave. His crew sat inside the claustrophobic steel interior, listening to the groan of canvas rubbing against armor. The temperature inside the tank climbed. Condensation trickled down the walls. Keller wiped sweat from his hands, gripping the controls. Nobody spoke much. There were no jokes now. Only the hum of the engine and the distant thunder of German artillery. By 1200 hours, the Germans began shelling the western bank again. Their artillery, firing from concealed positions near Fort Dryant and Fort Sami, bracketed the suspected crossing points. Explosions sent showers of mud and debris across the shoreline. One shell landed just 40 yards from an engineer team, tearing a section of canvas from a nearby raft. The engineers dove for cover as the tank inside the damaged skirt lurched dangerously, its buoyancy compromised. Someone shouted, "Get another skirt. Move, move, move." Against the clock and under fire, the engineers dragged a replacement canvas screen into position, working with frantic speed. Machine gun bullets clipped into the river, sending up needle-thin splashes. The desperation was palpable. And then, at 1315 hours, headquarters delivered a grim message. German forces were mobilizing for a major counterattack against the bridgehead. If tanks didn't make it across within the next few hours, the infantry on the far bank would be overrun. That news spread like wildfire. Crews clenched their jaws. Engineers doubled their pace. Officers shouted over the roar of engines and artillery. There was no more time for hesitation. By 1400 hours the order came down. Begin the crossing. First wave, go. Sherman No. 12, No. 14, and No. 9 lumbered forward, guided by assault boats on each flank. The river swallowed their canvas skirts inch by inch. At 20 yards from shore the current took hold, pulling them downstream. The assault boat crews strained to correct their path. The Germans spotted the movement. Machine guns opened up from concealed positions near the village of Dornot. Tracer rounds stitched across the water. Mortar shells splashed dangerously close. Yet the tanks kept advancing, slowly, painfully, almost stubbornly. Sergeant Markham and his crew watched from the bank, hearts pounding. If the first wave failed, the rest would never even attempt the crossing. At 1,422 hours, a mortar round struck near Sherman No. 14. The explosion tore open a section of its canvas screen. Air hissed out in a sickening rush. The tank began to list. Inside, the crew shouted for rescue. The assault boats surged toward it. Engineers scrambled with repair kits. The river pulled harder. And all along the western bank, crews waiting their turn felt their throats tighten. The canvas coffins were being tested. And the river was beginning to claim its price. What happened in the next moments would decide whether the crossing continued, or whether the entire operation collapsed into tragedy. For a moment, time seemed to freeze on the Moselle. Sherman No. 14 leaned hard to its right. Water splashed over the edge of the torn canvas skirt. The tank's engine roared as the driver instinctively tried to countersteer, but it was useless. The river had already taken control. The crew inside shouted over the intercom, their voices tight with rising panic. Water on the starboard side. Pressure dropping, fast. Get those boats in closer. 2 assault boats fought the current to reach the listing tank. Their operators, young engineer privates armed with nothing but grit and outboard motors, throttled forward, risking being pulled under themselves. German machine gun fire intensified. Rounds sparked off Sherman No. 14's turret like angry hornets. The river erupted in white splashes. At 1,424 hours, the tank gave a sickening lurch. One of the engineers screamed, "It's going under." The port side canvas buckled. River water surged over the rim. The tank dipped nose first. Within seconds, more than 10 tons of water flooded through cracks in the screen. The men inside did the only thing they could do, climb. The turret hatch exploded open. Corporal James Lyle hauled himself out first, water slapping against his legs. He reached back to pull up his loader, Private Anton Weiss, whose face was pale with terror. Then came the worst moment. The tank rolled. The Sherman's weight shifted, its center of gravity giving one final, fatal tilt. The entire vehicle pitched sideways and sank beneath them. With a roar and a violent pull downward, the tank disappeared into the Moselle, dragging Weiss partly under before Lyle wrenched him free. The suction nearly took both men. A single plume of muddy water marked where the tank had been. The river had claimed its first 6. Tim. Silence stretched across the American shore, broken only by the crack of machine guns. Tank crews standing outside their vehicles watched the spot where No. 14 vanished. Some swore quietly. Others whispered prayers. One young driver turned away and vomited into the mud. If one tank had gone down, others could follow. And the crews knew exactly what that meant for them. Sergeant Markham felt the cold press against his spine. He whispered to Keller, "We go in that river, we sink, we're done." Keller nodded without looking away from the water. "Yeah, I know." But the mission couldn't stop. Infantrymen across the river were already reporting German armor moving into position. Estimates suggested elements of the 6th Panzer Grenadier Regiment were regrouping for a coordinated strike. If the Americans didn't reinforce the bridgehead with armor, hundreds of infantrymen would die. So, despite the loss of Sherman No. 14, the engineers shouted the only order that made sense. "Keep moving. Next tank, forward." By 1500 hours, artillery fire thickened. Explosions hurled showers of water high into the air. The assault boats guiding Sherman No. 12 fought violently against the current as German gunners found the range. Sherman No. 9's canvas skirt ripped along a seam, forcing engineers to sprint across the shoreline with patch kits under a curtain of machine gun fire. Several were hit, 2 killed instantly, 1 wounded and dragged to safety. The situation was deteriorating fast. Across the river, infantry of the 11th Infantry Regiment sent desperate radio messages. "Enemy probing left flank. We need armor now. They're bringing up self-propelled guns, looks like Stoogie S." The tension grew unbearable. Sergeant Markham's tank, Sherman No. 17, waited in agonizing silence. The riverbank trembled with each artillery blast. His crew sat ready, each man absorbed in his own private fear. Inside the cramped steel belly of the tank, the air was hot, metallic, suffocating. Every sound was magnified. The creak of canvas, the thump of shells, the distant scream of ricochets. Then, at 1,522 hours, The radio crackled with a chilling update. German armor confirmed advancing from Dornat. Estimated arrival at the bridgehead in less than 40 minutes. The message hit the tank battalion like a gut punch. 40 minutes. The infantry didn't have 40 minutes. Lieutenant Colonel John Swenson, commander of the 735th Tank Battalion, made the call. A call that would define the crossing forever. He radioed to the engineers and first wave commanders. All remaining tanks, launch immediately. No delays. Get them across by any means. It was a desperate order. A necessary order. A deadly order. Markham felt his throat tighten as he climbed back into his Sherman. Keller muttered, "Guess this coffin's ours now." The canvas coffin creaked as the tank lurched forward. Every man watching knew this next wave would decide the fate of the bridgehead. If the tanks succeeded, even some of them, the Americans could hold. They failed. The Moselle would become a graveyard of steel, and the men on the far bank would be cut off, surrounded and crushed. The crisis had reached its breaking point. The river, the Germans and time itself were closing in. And 30 Shermans, wrapped in canvas and hope, were about to make their final bid for survival. As the afternoon stretched on, a small group of engineers devised an audacious, last-ditch solution. The original canvas skirts had failed under pressure because the seams couldn't withstand lateral river forces and enemy fire. To stabilize the tanks, they proposed reinforcing the skirts with wooden frames and adding additional air bladders, essentially converting each Sherman into a floating, self-righting barge. It was risky, almost reckless. Any miscalculation could capsize the tanks instantly. But the urgency was undeniable. German Stugs and infantry were now within 800 yards of the bridgehead, and the infantry desperately needed armored support. Sergeant Markham and his crew climbed back into Sherman No. 17, now fitted with reinforced frames and extra bladders. The river had calmed slightly, giving the engineers just enough window to act. Each tank was now carefully weighted to keep its center of gravity low and reduce tipping. By 15:45 hours, the second wave of tanks moved forward. Sherman No. 17 slid into the water. Unlike earlier attempts, the tank floated more steadily. The wooden frames kept the skirt rigid, the air bladders kept it buoyant, and the crew adjusted the engine throttle to counteract the current. Across the river, the 11th Infantry Regiment watched anxiously as the tank held its course. The Germans, noticing the renewed crossing, unleashed everything in their arsenal. Machine guns stitched the air with tracer rounds, artillery shells exploded nearby, and mortars showered the riverbank with mud. Yet Sherman No. 17 plowed forward, the reinforced canvas shrugging off small arms fire. Sergeant Markham felt every tremor, every jolt. But slowly, inch by inch, they moved. Private Keller shouted over the intercom, "We're making it, Sarge. We're actually making it." And indeed they were. The first of the second wave tanks reached the far bank, where infantrymen waded into the shallow water to guide it safely ashore. Buoyed by this success, the engineers and crews refined their technique on the fly. Each subsequent tank crossed faster, smoother, and more confidently. By 1610 hours, the majority of the 30 Shermans were on the far bank, their crews bruised but alive, their tanks bearing the marks of enemy fire and river damage, but floating. The turning point was as much psychological as it was tactical. The sight of Sherman tanks, once thought impossible to float, firmly on the far side of the Moselle gave the infantry renewed morale. They now had the firepower to repel the German counterattack. At 1625 hours, Lieutenant Colonel John Swenson observed from a vantage point. His report would later note, "The river had become an obstacle, the canvas skirts a necessity." Yet what happened next demonstrated ingenuity, courage, and sheer determination. Against all odds, 30 Shermans crossed the Moselle, and the bridgehead was saved. The engineers had improvised. The tank crews had risked their lives. And the soldiers on the far bank had gained the armored support they desperately needed. By 1640 hours, the final Sherman crossed. Mud and water streaked their armor, canvas flaps hung in tatters, yet they had survived. Infantrymen cheered, though cautiously, they knew the Germans could still strike. But the impossible had been achieved. 30 tanks, 30 canvas coffins, had floated across a river under enemy fire. Little did the crews know, this crossing would become legendary, studied in military engineering manuals and commemorated as one of the most daring armored river operations of the European campaign. By early evening, the Moselle River crossing was complete. All 30 Sherman tanks, battered and scarred, now stood on the far bank. Engineers and crews were exhausted, faces smeared with mud, hands blistered from gripping tools and controls, bodies shivering in the late September chill. The river had claimed only one tank, though the loss of its crew could have been catastrophic. All other men had survived thanks to quick thinking and heroic coordination. The bridgehead at Arneville, once fragile and vulnerable, was now reinforced. The combined firepower of 30 Shermans enabled the 5th Infantry Division to repel German counterattacks from the 17th SS Panzergrenadier Division and 6th Panzergrenadier Regiment. Enemy forces, surprised by the sudden appearance of armor, withdrew to regroup, leaving the Americans in control of the critical riverbank. Casualty reports listed 11 engineers killed or wounded and several tank crews with minor injuries, but the strategic gain was immense. Without those improvised canvas coffins, the infantry might have been annihilated, and the push toward Metz delayed significantly. The operation quickly entered the annals of U.S. armored history. Crews received commendations for bravery, including Bronze Stars and Soldiers' Medals for the engineers who risked everything under fire. Military historians later praised the crossing as a testament to innovation under pressure and the resilience of soldiers in the face of impossible odds. The Moselle crossing also influenced subsequent armored river operations, demonstrating that with ingenuity, training, and courage, even the most daunting natural obstacles could be overcome. Soldiers who witnessed it would recall the roar of engines, the smell of wet canvas, and the sight of 30 Sherman tanks bobbing across a river as one of the most surreal yet inspiring moments of the war. In military circles, the canvas coffins became a symbol, a reminder that in warfare, ingenuity and human courage can turn desperation into triumph. This was just one of countless untold stories from the Second World War. Subscribe to World War II Records as we continue to bring these forgotten chapters of history back to life.